Hey, what's up everyone? How's it going? This is Watch, and I've just completed my epic gaming slash workstation PC, and I'm gonna finally benchmark it for you guys to see what the performance results are. So if you're interested in seeing how this PC fares against different 4K gaming scenarios, as well as a couple of different benchmarks, you're definitely gonna be interested in this video. But if you haven't checked out the full PC build guide, you definitely wanna check that out before watching this video. But other than that, let's get right into this. Now, just before we begin our testing, I want to let you guys know that I have mildly overclocked both my CPU and my GPU. My CPU has been overclocked from 3.3 gigahertz to over 4 gigahertz. We could do a lot better in terms of overclocking, but I'm going to stick with 4 gigahertz because it's pretty stable based on my configuration right now. And I've also slightly overclocked our GTX 980 from 1266 megahertz to over 1400 megahertz. Now, the first thing I'm going to show you guys is the speed of the SSD RAID configuration that we have. For sequential write speeds, we're getting 1.4 gigabytes per second and over 600 megabytes per second in terms of write when we're specifically looking at the sequential read and write speeds, and that's pretty darn impressive. I've never had a computer that performed that well in terms of its read and write speeds. Next, we're going to test out our RAM and CPU configuration with using Geekbench 3, and on the multi-core score, we got a total score about 22,602, and on the single core score, we got about 3,836. Next, when we're taking a look at Cinebench, I'm going to actually do a side-by-side comparison of how fast the new computer is compared to my older generation Core i7 860 CPU that I had in my old computer. So we're going to run it at the same time. You can see how insanely quick the new Core i7 5820K is. We have overclocked it to 4 gigahertz, and it is insane in terms of the difference between these two Core i7s. And in terms of overall total score, we get about 1,195 points on our new 6-core. And in terms of GPU, we get about 177 frames per second using our GTX 980. Now, moving forward, we're going to take a look at the power consumption of this computer, and at idle, it is always under 119 watts, so pretty darn power efficient when you're not actually using the computer and it's just idling along. And when you have it on full load, and what we're doing to load up the CPU and GPU is we're using Prime 95 for the CPU and Firmark to max out our GPU. And at load, we're under 420 watts, and that is pretty darn power efficient. We have a 750 watt power supply in there that's gold certified, so we have more than enough power to perhaps even put another GTX 980 in there if I wanted. So definitely nice to see this amount of efficiency on this monster of a computer. And if you guys are interested in how loud this computer is at full load when you're loading up both the CPUs and GPUs, it only hovers around 45 decibels on the side of the case, and at the top of the case where we have our exhaust fans, it hovers around 57 decibels. And in person, I would have to say it's pretty quiet overall. Now, before I get into my gaming benchmark results for the GTX 980, I wanted to discuss the new feature on this card, which is the dynamic super resolution technology, which basically renders your games in 4K and then downsamples it to 1080p. This is great for somebody that has a 1080p monitor and wants to experience textures and details a little bit sharper than they would regularly experience on a 1080p display. It is going to tax the GPU a lot more, but that is a cool feature I do like about the GTX 980, but your frame rates are definitely going to suffer. So what we're going to specifically do in terms of benchmarking is not take a look at that. We're going to just look at regular resolutions for each of the individual monitors. Now, each game title is going to have 3 individual FPS scores. One is going to be pertaining the 1080p results, the other 1440p results, and 4K results, otherwise known as 2160p. So let's get right into my gaming benchmarks. Now, the first GPU test that we're going to do is use the Heaven benchmark from Untitled, which is a synthetic benchmark, and we're going to set everything at 1080p at 8 times anti-aliasing with ultra quality settings, and our final result is 76.8 frames per second with a score of 1934. Now, in terms of the games, we're going to first look at probably one of the hardest games to run on super high resolutions and just to run in general, which is Far Cry 4. We're going to set everything at ultra quality with 2 times MSAA. And at 1080p, we get a nice playable 58 frames per second. At 1440p, we get 41 frames per second. And at the full 4K resolution of 2160p, we get about 28 frames per second. So you could definitely play this game at 4K if you lower down the quality and anti-aliasing settings. Next, Metro Last Light at very high quality settings. We're getting about 85 frames per second at 1080p, 61 frames per second at 1440p, and at 2160p, we're getting a solid 33 frames per second. Again, this game is playable at Ultra HD resolutions if you lower down the quality settings. Now, Grid Auto Sports at completely maxed out settings at 1080p is getting a very impressive 138 frames per second, 104 frames per second at 1440p, and 78 frames per second at full 4K resolutions. After that, we're going to be taking a look at the results of a Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor at very high settings, and at 1080p, it's at 113 frames per second, 1440p is 78 frames per second, and at full 4K resolution, we're getting about 41 frames per second, which is certainly playable. Looking at the all-popular Battlefield 4 at ultra settings, 2x MSA enabled, we're looking at 108 frames per second at 1080p, which is absolutely insane, 74 frames per second at 1440p, and 38 frames per second at full 4K resolution. And last but certainly not least, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare at completely maxed out settings, 2x SMAA settings. We're getting about 138 frames per second at 1080p, 109 frames per second at 1440p, and a very impressive 57 frames per second at 2160p. Now, as I mentioned before, the GPU has been really mildly overclocked, but one of the great things about the 980 is that there's a lot of headroom for overclocking. I've probably pushed it to about halfway of what it could potentially do, so there's still a lot that I can get out of it. And if you're wanting to get a kind of future-proof 4K ready GPU, I think you definitely want to take a look at the GTX 980 if you can manage to fork over the $600. But I think it's certainly worth it based on the results that we're looking at right over here. But other than that, guys, that's really it. If you have specific questions about anything I talked about, please make sure to leave that on a comment down below. Also, if you haven't checked out the full-length build guide of this computer, you definitely want to check that out. But hopefully this gave you a good kind of insight on how this performs in real life. Thanks so much for your support again, and we'll see you later. Take care.